After watching the new documentary Vaxxed, From Cover-Up to Catastrophe, it is easy to see why the establishment is trying so hard to make sure you never watch it. At the very least, the movie raises some extremely troubling questions that absolutely must be answered, as quickly as possible. If the experts, doctors, parents, and others interviewed in the 91-minute film are even partially correct, millions of lives are being needlessly destroyed, and the cost to taxpayers will likely reach into the trillions of dollars. But the movie does more than just raise troubling questions. It exposes a conspiracy, and yes, that is the correct term, involving top officials of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, to deliberately conceal data showing a causal link between vaccines and autism. If proven in a court of law, America and humanity have been victims of a crime of monumental proportions that must be dealt with as harshly as possible. The movie will very likely break your heart. After opening with deceptive news clips blaming a California measles outbreak on parents who do not vaccinate, vaccinated children often get measles, too. The film introduces Dr. William Thompson, senior scientist at CDC. He became a whistleblower after finding out that the CDC was omitting important data on vaccines. "We lied about the scientific findings," Thompson can be heard saying in a recording played in the film. The CDC can no longer be trusted to do vaccine safety work. The saga began in 2004, when Thompson led a CDC study on the measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, vaccine and its potential link to autism. The CDC omitted statistically significant information in a 2004 article published in the journal Pediatrics, Thompson admitted in a 2014 letter. Essentially, the data that was concealed from the public revealed a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. Documents were later destroyed, too. Government scientists are also exposed in emails seemingly discussing covering up the data showing the links between vaccines and autism. In fact, according to whistleblower Thompson, CDC officials destroyed the documents showing the links. That's what I keep seeing again and again and again, where these senior people do completely unethical, vile things and no one holds them accountable, Thompson says in a voice recording. Unsurprisingly, none of the CDC officials implicated in the scandal were willing to be interviewed for Vaxxed. Thompson's comments played in the film were recorded, apparently without the CDC scientists' knowledge, by Dr. Brian Hooker, an environmental scientist and the father of a son who became autistic 2 weeks after being vaccinated. In the film, Dr. Hooker explains how he worked with whistleblower Thompson to find out what data was needed, how to request the data and the studies from the CDC, and more. Eventually, a CDC lawyer threatened Dr. Hooker in a letter warning him not to contact the federal agency anymore. But the facts were coming out. According to the CDC's data that was concealed from the public, Black children who received their shots on time seemed to be especially vulnerable to becoming autistic after receiving the vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. The CDC's research showed that Black children who received the MMR vaccine on schedule were between 2 and 3 times more likely to get autism than those who did not. In fact, in some interpretations, Black children were as much as 7 times more likely to become autistic. But the problem goes beyond Black children, too. Numerous parents interviewed in the film tell of taking their children for an MMR vaccine, going home, and then discovering that their children have fever, convulsions, and more before eventually displaying autism-type symptoms. The before and after videos of the children are heartbreaking. And a number of experts on the subject, such as Dr. Dorian Granpeesheh, a world-renowned clinical psychologist and founder of the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, discuss how the number of autism diagnoses has been skyrocketing upwards for decades. Official data also shows something is terribly wrong. For example, a chart that appears on the screen, based on data collected by the CDC, shows prevalence of autism in children going from around 1 case in 10,000 children before the 1970s, to 1 case in 5,000 by 1975, to 1 case in 500 by the mid-1990s, to more than 1 child in 50 today. Over that time period, the number of government-mandated vaccines given to children has more than tripled. The surge in federally recommended and state-mandated vaccines continues. If the current trend of exponential growth rates in autism cases continues, 1 out of every 2 children and 80% of boys will have autism by the year 2032, according to Dr. Stephanie Seneff, a senior research scientist in artificial intelligence at MIT. Dr. Seneff began studying autism when one of her friend's children became autistic following a vaccine for diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, DPT. If current trends continue, society will soon be completely paralyzed trying to handle the explosion in autism, the MIT scientist explained. Del Bigtree, a medical journalist involved in making the film, is also interviewed for the documentary. Among other explosive revelations, he points out that the federal government, which does all sorts of studies purporting to show the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, still refuses to do studies comparing rates of autism between vaccinated and unvaccinated children, even though such studies are routinely performed for virtually all other drugs. So why does the CDC refuse to do the vaxxed versus unvaxxed study? Probably because when we look at this study, showing autism rates are much higher in children who got vaccines on time than in those whose vaccines were delayed, we realize that the risk would be astronomical, Bigtree explains in the film. It is likely to be one of the major reasons we're seeing this skyrocketing increase of autism, worldwide. Bigtree also highlights how Big Pharma and its advertising dollars, many of them extracted from consumers with help and mandates from big government, have a virtual stranglehold on the media and especially in its coverage of health and medical issues. Bigtree, for instance, says he was unable to report the explosive story of CDC fraud on his medical talk show because Big Pharma funded the program. Still, despite being unable to discuss it himself, he assumed that other media outlets would pick up the story of massive CDC fraud and cover-up and run with it. Not one mainstream media source went anywhere near this story, Bigtree said. For perspective, the film contrasts media hysteria over a measles outbreak in 2014. There were 644 cases, none fatal, versus autism, of which there were over 1 million diagnoses that year. Another key player in the film is the now famous Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who explains in the film how he got involved in researching possible links between vaccines and autism. It all began when a parent called and said their child had become autistic and had developed gastrointestinal problems following vaccination with MMR. Wakefield and other gastroenterologists realized there seemed to be a pattern linking the MMR vaccine to both autism and the gastrointestinal problems. Essentially, a large number of parents were reporting that their children's regression into autism happened after administration of the MMR vaccine. It wasn't our place to censor their story because it may be uncomfortable for public health, explained Wakefield in the film. Our job was to report that story accurately in order that it might lead to further investigation. Wakefield and a group of his colleagues published a paper on the subject in 1998 in the prestigious UK medical journal known as The Lancet. Basically, the study suggested the possibility of a link between autism, a new type of bowel disease, and the MMR vaccine, but concluded that more work would be needed to find out what was happening. Lawsuits were filed by injured children and families, with Wakefield serving as an expert witness. In response, Big Pharma and its allies joined forces in what Wakefield suggests was an organized effort to frame him, destroy his career, and protect the vaccine manufacturers. Years later, the study was also retracted by the journal for 2 ostensible reasons. The children in the study were sequentially investigated, and there was no ethical approval for the study. But Wakefield and his legions of supporters, especially among parents of injured children, continue to defend his work. In the film, Wakefield also tells of how earlier MMR vaccines were found to cause meningitis. First, it happened in Canada. So, the vaccine was withdrawn there. Then it went to the United Kingdom, and the same thing happened, forcing the shot to be withdrawn from that market. Finally, the meningitis-linked MMR vaccine was deployed in third world countries. And if some of the experts in the film are to be believed, and there seems to be no reason why they should not be, then this sort of behavior is typical of the crony pharmaceutical companies. One of the people interviewed, for example, was Brandy Vaughan, who was a sales representative for the Vaxxed drug produced by Merck. In the interview, Vaughan explains that Merck manipulated data and covered up the fact that Vaxxed produced twice as many strokes and heart attacks as the placebo, apparently resulting in some 50,000 additional deaths. What I learned is that just because things are on the market doesn't mean they are safe, she said. If a drug company gets one vaccine added to the CDC schedule, they can make upward of $30 billion in 1 year. Much of this has been noticed in Congress, despite the best efforts of big business and big government. Several current and former congressmen are featured in Vaxxed, including former Representative Dan Burton of Indiana and ex-Congressman David Weldon, who is also a doctor. Their comments in the film are extremely revealing. The film also shows Representative Bill Posey, a Republican from Florida, grilling CDC bosses on whether there had been a study done comparing rates of autism between vaccinated and unvaccinated children. All of the lawmakers shown in the film have been hoping to have the CDC whistleblower, Thompson, brought before Congress to testify on what he knows. But so far, lawmakers, many of whom receive massive campaign contributions from big pharma lobbyists, have refused to pursue the matter. Instead, members of Congress appear more interested in helping to enrich big pharma using government power. Consider, for example, a 1986 federal statute highlighted in the film. The scheme, passed by Congress at the behest of big pharma lobbyists, shields vaccine manufacturers from liability for deaths and injuries caused by their products. Basically, if a vaccine kills your child or permanently disables you, the manufacturer of the vaccine cannot be held liable. Instead, the federal government created a special court where tax-funded federal lawyers defend vaccines and where taxpayers are on the hook for any damages. Billions have already been paid out. But no other industry enjoys such immunity from liability. In fact, a public interest attorney interviewed for the film points out that, if vaccines really are linked to autism or other major health issues, the government could be facing hundreds of billions or even $1 trillion in liability as the autism epidemic continues exploding. He suggests that this situation alone would have provided enough motive for the feds to conceal data and create fake studies pretending to exonerate the vaccines. Vaxxed concludes by urging viewers to contact Congress to demand that Thompson be subpoenaed and that the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act be repealed so manufacturers can be held liable. The documentary and several experts interviewed in it also call for making single measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines available so that the potentially dangerous combination vaccine can be avoided. And finally, the experts in the film suggest that vaccines should be classified as pharmaceuticals so that they must undergo thorough and proper testing before being injected into millions of children. Unsurprisingly, the establishment media, flush with big pharma advertising dollars, are doing their best to either ignore or demonize Vaxxed and the people behind it. That should provide Americans, almost all of whom have already realized that the national press is not trustworthy, even more reason to see the film. The documentary can be viewed online for a small fee, or at select theaters across the country. The DVD can be pre-ordered online as well. While the documentary is terribly sad, and perhaps frightening, it is also incredibly important. Americans and humanity must have answers to the questions raised, and with the disaster continuing to get worse on a daily basis, Answers must come soon. If crimes were committed, those responsible should be held accountable. But a good starting point is for the information in the film to become